I'm so glad to have you back on my storytelling channel. How was your day? Was it a good one? Before we begin tonight's gentle bedtime journey, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel to support me. The story I'll be sharing with you today is titled The Gentle Empire of Cornelius Vanderbilt. Chapter 1. The Quiet Shores of Staten Island. Long ago, when the world moved a little slower and the nights seemed a little quieter, a boy named Cornelius Vanderbilt was born near the gentle shores of Staten Island, New York. The year was 1794, and the sun rose that day over still waters, as if to welcome a child who would one day shape the paths of ships and railroads across an entire country. Cornelius was the fourth of 9 children, born into a family that lived simply but proudly. His father, Phoebe, was kind-hearted and steady, while his mother, Cornelia, was strong, firm, and full of purpose. Their home, not far from the water's edge, often smelled of salt and seagrass, and the breeze that drifted through their wooden shutters carried the distant call of seagulls. Even as a little boy, Cornelius, whom everyone called Cornel, felt a quiet pull toward the harbor. He could sit for hours watching the sailboats glide over the bay, their white sails full of wind like the wings of peaceful birds. Sometimes he'd sneak away from his chores just to listen to the creaking of the docks and the lap of the tide against the rocks. There was something in the rhythm of the waves that matched the beat of his young heart. His family was not wealthy, but they were resourceful. Cornelius's father ran a small boat that ferried cargo and passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. It was hard work, rowing through storms and fog, but it gave young Cornel his first taste of what it meant to move people and goods from place to place. He admired his father's strength and steadiness, even when times were tough. When Cornelius was 11 years old, he began helping with the boat. It was a simple, rough vessel, nothing fancy, but he treated it like treasure. He learned to tie ropes, patch sails, and steer through both calm and choppy waters. Though his hands grew calloused and his back sometimes ached, there was peace. In the water, he liked being needed. He liked being part of something that mattered. But Cornelius was not just a boy of the sea. He was a boy of dreams. Sometimes at night, after a long day working on the boat, he would lie in bed and imagine himself sailing beyond the harbor, past the tip of Manhattan, out into great unknown rivers that ran deep into the land. He dreamed of machines that could move faster than the wind, of cities connected by invisible lines, and of quiet strength built not on noise, but on action. At school, Cornelius struggled. He wasn't fond of books or long lessons, and he often felt restless when asked to sit still. But no one could deny how sharp his mind was. He could memorize maps after only one glance. He could bargain with merchants twice his age, and when a neighbor's horse broke its harness, young Cornelius fixed it with little more than a few nails and some twine. By the age of 15, he had saved enough money, mostly through odd jobs and helping his father, to buy his own small boat. It was battered and old, with paint peeling and planks creaking, but it was his. He named it the Swifter, a word he had read once in a sailor's tale. It meant fast and certain, just like the future he dreamed of. Each morning, Cornelius set out with the rising sun, ferrying farmers, cargo, and sometimes livestock across the water. He worked in silence, focusing on the wind, the tide, and the distant skyline of New York City, which even then was beginning to rise like a promise on the edge of the world. And as he rode, the wind whispered around him as if the sea itself had secrets to share. "You are meant to go far," it seemed to say, not quickly, but steadily, like the tide. One night, as he sat watching the stars blink above the harbor, his mother came to sit beside him. She placed her hand gently on his shoulder and looked out at the boats. "You work hard, Cornel," she said in a soft voice. "But don't forget, it's not just strength that moves a man forward, it's his will." He nodded. He didn't speak much then. He was never one for many words. But he listened, and he remembered. From that quiet beginning, just a boy with a boat, watching the water and dreaming softly, Cornelius Vanderbilt would one day become one of the most powerful men in America. But for now, he was simply Cornel, sailing across the bay with the sunrise in his eyes and a gentle determination in his heart. And as the stars twinkled over Staten Island and the harbor settled into sleep, so too did Cornelius, curled beneath a wool blanket, dreaming of steam, speed, and the endless road ahead. Chapter 2. The little ferry that cootas the first light of morning stretched across the water. The swifter bobbed gently by the dock, waiting for its captain. Cornelius Vanderbilt, now 16 years old, stepped onto the worn planks with quiet confidence. His hands were rough from rope and salt, his clothes patched from long days of labor, but there was a steadiness in his step and a calm fire in his chest. He had built something for himself. One boat ferry service between Staten Island and Manhattan. It wasn't much, not yet, but it was his, and it worked. People trusted him. Farmers brought crates of vegetables. Fishermen brought their catch, and weary travelers asked for a ride across the bay. Cornelius didn't just row them, he gave them safety. He knew the tides better than anyone. He read the wind like a book, though the city across the water was growing busier by the day. Cornelius's part of the world remained quiet. The waves rolled in and out, whispering their secrets, and the sun rose slowly over the New York skyline, casting gold over the gentle ripples. One foggy morning, a neighbor approached him, rubbing his hands with worry. "My wife needs to get to Manhattan," he said, voice low, "but the boats won't go in this weather." Cornelius looked out at the thick mist that clung to the harbor. Then he looked at his boat. "I'll take her," he said softly, and he did. He navigated by feel, by memory, and by instinct. When others might have panicked, he remained calm. The little ferry glided through the mist like a ghost, emerging on the other side, safe and sound. The neighbor's wife arrived just in time for her doctor's appointment. Word spread quietly across Staten Island. Cornel doesn't turn people away. Soon, more passengers came. Some paid in coins, others in potatoes or pies. Cornelius never made a fuss. He took what he was given, always grateful, always focused on his work. He didn't dream of being rich, not yet. He simply wanted to keep going faster, farther, better. That winter, he saved up enough to buy a second boat. It was small and slow, but it meant expansion. Now he could ferry more people, make more trips, and help more families. He hired a friend to help him with the second vessel, and together they worked through snow and wind, frost clinging to their sleeves. The two boats, though humble, became known as dependable, steady, and above all honest. People liked that about Cornelius. He didn't talk much, but he always kept his word. One evening, as he sat mending a torn sail by lantern light, his father came to visit. The old man sat beside him, quiet, watching. "You've done well, son," he said after a while. "Real well." Cornelius nodded. "Still a long way to go." His father chuckled. "Maybe. But the ones who go far are the ones who don't rush." That night, Cornelius lay awake, listening to the wind outside. It was gentle, like a lullaby, brushing softly against the window pane. He thought of the boats, the tides, and the faces of the passengers he'd carried across the bay. So many people, each with their own story, each trusting him with a part of their journey. He realized something quietly. This wasn't just work. It was a service, a connection. He was a bridge between islands, between lives. And that was worth more than money. The next morning, he carved a small symbol into the wood of the Swiftjura, simple V, shaped like two wings meeting at a point. It was his mark, not for pride, but for remembrance. A reminder that every journey, no matter how small, had value. As spring returned and the harbor thawed, business grew. The little ferry became a familiar sight, cutting across the bay like a quiet promise. And Cornelius, with sleeves rolled up and eyes toward the horizon, kept rowing forward. Not quickly, not loudly, but surely, and surely enough. And as twilight painted the sky with soft lavender hues, and the city lights blinked to life across the water, the Swiftjura glided home once more, its lantern glowing like a star upon the sea. Cornelius tied it gently, stepped onto the dock, and looked back just once before heading home. The boat rocked softly in the tide, as if whispering, "You're doing just fine." Chapter 3. Steam and Sunrise. The days turned to seasons, and the small ferry service of young Cornelius Vanderbilt flourished like a quiet garden by the sea. Staten Island knew his name now, and so did the bustling docks of Manhattan. Whispers of his reliability reached further, each weeknot in the loud tones of pride, but in the gentle certainty of trust. But the world was changing. A new sound had begun to hum across the harbors and rivers of America, the creak of wood and the flap of sails, but the hiss and sigh of steam. Steamships, iron giants, compared to the modest rowboats of old, were beginning to appear on the horizon. They puffed white clouds into the sky and sliced through the water with power that did not rely on wind or tide. Cornelius watched them from the edge of the dock one morning. His boots were wet with dew, and a warm cup of coffee steamed in his hands. He said nothing as a tall black steamboat chugged past, its smokestack towering, its paddle wheel churning like the heartbeat of a new era. He didn't speak, but his mind stirred. Steam was the future. It was louder, faster, and stronger. And Cornelius, though rooted in calm and tradition, knew how to listen to the winds of change. He was still a young man, just 17, when he made a quiet decision. He would learn everything he could about steamboats, not from a distance, not from books, but from the very deck of one dot. With little more than determination and a neatly written letter of request, he found a job as a deckhand aboard a steamer bound for New Jersey. It was hard work, hot, heavy, and greasy, but Cornelius had never minded hard work. He scrubbed floors, shoveled coal, tightened bolts, and paid close attention to every hiss and grind of the engine. He didn't complain, he didn't boast, he simply learned. Day by day, he watched the pilots steer, the engineer adjusts valves, and the captain calculates schedules and cargo. Cornelius asked careful questions, only when the time was right. The crew came to like him. They called him Steamboat Cornel, half as a joke, half in admiration. One cool evening, as they docked along the Hudson River, the captain invited Cornelius to sit beside him. The sky was a blanket of stars, and the great city shimmered quietly in the distance. "You've got eyes like an old sea dog," the captain said, lighting a pipe. "You don't just see what's there, you see what could be." Cornelius smiled faintly. "Steam is faster than wind," he said softly, "but it still needs a steady hand." The captain nodded, thoughtful and a steady man. Over the next few years, Cornelius worked his way up from deckhand to pilot, and from pilot to partner. He saved his money and studied maps, tides, and routes. He paid close attention to how business was done, how freight was priced, how passengers were treated, and how schedules made the difference between success and loss. He never rushed, he never gambled, but he always moved forward when he had saved enough. Cornelius bought a share in a small steamboat of his own, then another. Soon he had a small fleet, nothing grand, but enough to make his presence felt. But Vanderbilt never ran his boats the way others did. While competitors raised prices, he lowered his. While others added frills, he kept things simple. He offered clean decks, fair treatment, and dependable routes. His passengers, farmers, workers, mothers with children, felt safe with him. And slowly, gently, more of them chose his boats over the fancier ones, not because he shouted, not because he boasted, but because he delivered. One autumn morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the harbor, Cornelius stood on the deck of his steamer, watching the city lights flicker out as the day began. The wind tugged gently at his coat, and the sound of steam exhaling from the engine filled the air like a lullaby. He closed his eyes for a moment. The sea, the city, the steam, they were no longer separate things. They were part of his journey, part of his rhythm. And even though the world around him was changing faster than ever, he moved through it with the same quiet certainty he'd carried since boyhood. That night, as the boat rocked gently by the pier and the stars appeared one by one, Cornelius sat alone by the railing. A young boy, perhaps no older than he had once been, stood beside him. "Are you the owner?" the boy asked shyly. Cornelius nodded. "I am." The boy stared at the great steam engine behind them, wide-eyed. "It's so big. Weren't you scared of it?" Cornelius chuckled softly. "I was, for a little while. But even big things can be learned if you take your time." The boy smiled, and Cornelius placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember," he said gently, "it's not how fast you go, it's how steady you steer." And with that, the harbor slipped into sleep, and the soft hush of the waves rocked the steamboats like cradles beneath the moon. Chapter 4. Calm Waters. Bold moves. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt was in his early 20s, the young ferry captain from Staten Island had become a quiet presence along the East River. His boats were not the fanciest, nor the grandest, but they were the most trusted. And in a world where fog could swallow a ship and storms could turn calm waters wild, trust was everything. Each morning, his steamers left the docks with the same grace and precision. Farmers with baskets, workers with tools, and women with market goods stepped aboard, their faces peaceful. They knew they would reach their destination, and they knew they would not be cheated, jostled, or forgotten. That was the Vanderbilt way, quiet, fair, steady. But even in peace, Cornelius was thinking. Ahead, he began to notice gaps, places where ferry lines were unreliable, or where small towns had no service at all. So while others competed noisily on busy routes, Vanderbilt looked to the edges, the forgotten corners, the spaces in between. He sent boats to places others ignored, filling quiet needs before they became loud demands. These were bold moves, but bold in the Vanderbilt style, thoughtful, quiet, and patient. He also began to lower prices, not just a little but dramatically. Where other ferry companies charged $1, Cornelius charged 25 cents. At first, people laughed. They called it foolish. He'll lose everything, they said. But Cornelius had done the math. He understood that a full boat at a low price could earn more than an empty one at a high price. And he understood something deeper. When people feel respected, they come back, and come back they did. Passengers filled his decks. Competitors fumed. Some slandered him in the newspapers, calling him reckless. Others tried to block him from docking at city piers. But Cornelius, ever calm, found his way. If he couldn't dock at one pier, he built his own. If they tried to outprice him, he dropped his fares again. He never raised his voice. He never sought revenge. He simply outworked them. His boats were faster, his crews better trained, his schedules tighter. And over time, the noise of his critics faded, replaced by the quiet success of a man who let his actions speak. One day, while checking on repairs at a dock in New Jersey, an old steamboat captain stopped him. "You know," the man said, adjusting his cap, "you don't run things like the rest of us." Cornelius smiled faintly. "I've never been much for shouting," the captain laughed. "Well, you may not shout, but you sure make waves." Cornelius nodded. Waves carry ships. He expanded his business slowly, carefully. He bought more boats, hired better men, drew up new routes. Every decision was measured, not by what was loudest, but by what lasted. He even began to dress a little finer, still simple, still modest, but with cleaner boots, a longer coat, and a quiet dignity. People began to call him Commodore, not as a title, but as a sign of respect. And though he never demanded the name, he accepted it with grace. Commodore Vanderbilt. It had a calm strength to it, like a ship that sails steady through wind and storm alike. But through all his growth, Cornelius never forgot where he came from. He still visited Staten Island, still walked the same docks where he once tied the He paid his workers fairly and helped some of them start businesses of their own. He gave quietly to churches and families in need, not with speeches, not with ceremonies, just with quiet kindness. One chilly evening, as a fog rolled in over the water and lanterns flickered on along the docks, Vanderbilt stood at the edge of his growing fleet. He looked at each boat, each one once a dream, now gently swaying in. The tide, a young boy, wide-eyed and curious, approached him. "Are they all yours?" the boy asked. Cornelius looked out across the water. The steamers, with their black stacks and polished wood, gleamed like sleeping giants under the moonlight. "They're not really mine," he said softly. "I just take care of them, for the people who ride them." The boy thought for a moment, then smiled. "Like a shepherd?" he asked. Cornelius chuckled. "Yes, something like that." And as the last boat returned to harbor, its engine sighing with rest, the Commodore turned home. His boots echoed softly on the dock, each step firm, each step steady. Bold moves didn't always require noise. Sometimes the boldest thing a man could do was to stay calm, stay kind, and keep moving forward. Chapter 5. The Iron Road Beckons. The river had been good to Cornelius Vanderbilt. His steamers moved like clockwork across bays and harbors, connecting towns, people, and dreams. Passengers trusted his boats the way they trusted the rising sun, steady, sure, and always on time. He had built a small empire of wood and water, powered by steam and purpose, but the world, ever turning, had begun to murmur something new. Iron. It came first as a whisper, steel wheels turning slowly over wooden ties, engines puffing soot into the morning air. Railroads, once short and uncertain, were now beginning to stretch farther and farther across the land, connecting places the rivers could not reach. Trains rolled through hills and valleys, through cities and farmland, pulling with them the promise of a faster, larger future. Vanderbilt, standing on the deck of his largest steamer, watched the smoke from a distant locomotive curl into the sky like a question. He said nothing, but deep in his mind, wheels were already turning. The river had taught him many things: patience, balance, and respect. But now the land called to him not as a replacement, but as an expansion. He did not rush, he did not leap, he simply listened, and soon, quietly, he stepped ashore. At first, Vanderbilt began to invest not in bold, dramatic fashion, but in his usual way, thoughtful, deliberate. He bought shares in small rail lines, studied their paths, met with their engineers. He sat with conductors and station masters, asking careful questions, observing how the iron roads worked and where they stumbled. It didn't take long to see the truth. Many railroads were messy, disorganized, and often run with pride instead of purpose. Their schedules clashed, their prices shifted, and their tracks ended in the wrong places. Vanderbilt, who believed deeply in order and reliability, saw opportunity in the chaos. He bought into one line, then another, slowly, like fitting pieces of a quiet puzzle. He began connecting them, streamlining routes, trimming waste, and building something stronger than any single railroad. His rivals mocked him again. Old steamboat Cornel doesn't understand trains, they laughed. He'll run them like ferry boats. But Vanderbilt only smiled. After all, ferry boats had built his fortune. He didn't need to move fast. He needed to move wisely. One evening, as a gentle snow began to fall across the city, Vanderbilt sat in his study, maps spread out before him. Lines drawn in ink stretched from the Hudson River to faraway towns Albany, Buffalo, Chicago. The fire crackled softly behind him, and the room smelled of old wood and worn leather. His wife, Sophia, entered quietly and placed a cup of tea beside him. She looked at the tangled rail lines and smiled. "You used to talk about boats in your sleep," she teased. Cornelius looked up, thoughtful. "Now I dream of steel." She kissed his forehead and left him to his work, the fire glowing like the hearth of a locomotive. Within a few years, Vanderbilt's railroad network had become one of the most efficient in the country. He did not shout about it. He did not hold grand celebrations. He simply ran his lines on time, kept his fares low, and treated his passengers with dignity. And just as before, the people came. They came with suitcases, with stories, with hopes for work or love or change. Vanderbilt's trains became more than just transportation. They became threads, stitching together the great quilt of America. He walked the platforms sometimes, his coat buttoned against the wind, listening to the rhythm of train wheels on track. The sound was different from waves, but just as soothing, steady, predictable, powerful. One afternoon, a young conductor approached him at Grand Central Depot. "Sir," the man said nervously, "how did you know railroads were the next thing?" Cornelius looked out at the trains lined up beneath the high arches of the station. He watched a family board one, their laughter drifting like music through the air. "I didn't know," he said simply. "I listened." The conductor tilted his head. "To whom?" "To the world," Vanderbilt replied softly. "It always speaks quietly, like the tide. You just have to be still long enough to hear it." And with that, the Commodore stepped onto the next train, not as a ruler, but as a rider content to sit beside the people he served, hands resting in his lap, eyes gazing softly at the horizon. Chapter 6. Tracks of Fortune. The rhythm of steel had become familiar now. Each morning, Captain was now master of the rails. His name traveled farther than his trains, from city streets to quiet farmland, always spoken with a mix of respect and curiosity. Yet the man himself remained simple. He did not live in loud luxury or boast of his wealth, carried coal, lumber, letters, and dreams. And he never lost sight of what mattered most, the people. He insisted his stations be clean and safe. He pushed for predictable timetables so workers could count on arriving home for dinner. He didn't lead from behind a curtain. He walked the platforms, stepped into the cars, and tipped his hat to grandmothers carrying baskets. The press called him ruthless. They didn't see him gently fixing a crooked sign at the Poughkeepsie station. They didn't hear him calming a weeping passenger whose luggage had been lost to Vanderbilt. Fortune was not in gold. It was in good service, sound rails, and quiet pride. Still, the fortune came. His network of railroads, once broken, scattered, and weak, had become the spine of Eastern America. Freight moved faster. Passengers moved cheaper. Cities grew around. The rails, like flowers, reaching for sunlight. His most famous acquisition was the New York Central Railroad. With calm precision, he united it with his other lines, creating a single, strong system from New York to Chicago. No fanfare, no fireworks, just paper, signed in a quiet room. And then the work began. He didn't tear things down, he improved them. He built better bridges, stronger engines, more efficient terminals. His trains grew longer, smoother, and more dependable. They stopped less often. They ran more often, and the country noticed. One snowy afternoon, a senator from Ohio visited Vanderbilt at his office in Manhattan. The Commodore stood beside a wide window, watching the city bustle below. "Do you know," the senator asked, "how much of the nation now rides on your rails?" Cornelius turned slowly. "No," he said, "not empire, just people. But fortune, like iron, carries weight." And as his wealth grew beyond imagination, beyond measurements, so did the burden of choice. What would he do with it all? He began to think of the future, not just of the rails, but of the country. He supported schools. He helped families struck by loss. And when a worker was injured on the job, Vanderbilt often paid the hospital fees himself quietly, through a letter or trusted messenger. One evening, as twilight settled across the Hudson River and the trains slowed for the night, Cornelius sat in his garden. The air was cool, the sky full of stars. A robin sang a final tune in the trees beside him. Train drifted like a lullaby, because people still need to get home, he said softly, and the road is long. The boy leaned his head on his grandfather's shoulder, and together they listened to the gentle rumble of tracks far off in the hills. And so the fortune grew not only in numbers, but in meaning, in quiet dignity, in steady hands. In every mile of rail there was a whisper of the river, a memory of a wooden ferry rocking gently in the tide. Cornelius Vanderbilt had become one of the richest men in America, but to him the true wealth had always been the same: time well spent, work done right. Chapter 7. The Gentle Giant of New York. The streets of New York bustled louder than ever. Horse-drawn wagons clattered over cobblestone. Street vendors called out beneath awnings. Children played stickball in alleyways, while women in long dresses passed beneath gas lamps just beginning to glow. The city was stretching upward, brick by brick, beam by beam manned. In the very heart of it stood a man who hardly raised his voice, Cornelius Vanderbilt, though he rarely appeared in public ceremonies. His presence was everywhere. His trains arrived on time. His name was etched into contracts, whispered at city meetings, and murmured in letters between businessmen. Yet, to most people, he remained a mystery. Some said he was stern, others called him brilliant, but those who knew him well used simpler words: quiet, focused, kind. By now, Vanderbilt was more than just a businessman. He was a symbol, not of flash or flair, but of function. His work spoke for itself, like the silent hum of a well-oiled machine. But the city, with all its motion and noise, never pulled him away from the rhythm he'd always known: early to rise, steady to build, and gentle in spirit. One day, a reporter managed to find him walking along the platform at Grand Central Depot. The man, breathless, hurried beside him. "Mr. Vanderbilt," he said quickly, "what do you think of being the richest man in New York?" Cornelius paused. He looked out at the rows of train cars, each one waiting to carry someone home, to work, or toward something new. Then he turned back to the young reporter with a small smile. "I think people care more about getting where they need to go," he said. Then he tipped his hat and stepped aboard the next train. Grand Central Depot was one of his proudest achievements, not because of its size, but because of what it meant. It brought all the lines together. It was not just a station. It was a meeting place, a crossroads of lives. From it, people could travel to Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland, or Chicago. And it all began here, where the soft thunder of train wheels echoed through the stone halls. As New York grew, so did Vanderbilt's responsibility. He expanded rail lines carefully, joining them not with force, but with logic. He ensured his employees were paid fairly and trained well. Just wealth, but trust. His competitors, those who once called him reckless, now watched silently as the Commodore became not only powerful, but beloved. Yet, with his growing fortune, came personal challenges. His family, large and sprawling, did not always agree on how things should be run. Some of his sons wished for more freedom. Others lacked the same patience their father had spent a lifetime cultivating. Vanderbilt, though calm in business, struggled at times with his role as a father. He loved them all, but leadership, he knew, could not be inherited. It had to be earned. Still, he never gave up on them. In quiet moments, he would take his son, William, for long walks through the countryside or along the piers. They rarely spoke of money. Instead, they talked of the wind, of maps, of how to know when it's time to lead and when it's time to listen. "You can't steer a train with your voice," he told him one night. "You steer it by laying the track right, long before the wheels ever move." William nodded and remembered. The people of New York came to see Vanderbilt as something like a lighthouse, silent, unmoving, but always shining. He gave generously to those who needed help. A burned-down hospital was rebuilt with his quiet donations. Schools received books. Poor children were given warm coats in the winter, but he never made a show of it. He gave the way he worked, with purpose, not pride. One autumn evening, as red and gold leaves blew gently down Park Avenue, Vanderbilt stood at a high window overlooking the city. Below, the lights of carriages flickered like fireflies. The trains beneath the streets rumbled softly on their nightly runs. The world was moving, and he had helped it move, not as a king, but as a servant of motion, a steward of trust. Sophia stood beside him and laid her hand on his arm. "You've given them a road," she said. He looked down at the streets, the rails, a way forward. "I just made it a little smoother." And as the evening deepened and the wind whispered against the windows, the gentle giant of New York turned off the lamp, took his wife's hand, and walked to bed, his heart steady, his mind calm, his legacy already growing like ivy across the walls of time. Chapter 8. Family, Fortune, and Falling Leaves. The air had grown cooler now. The bustling energy of summer had faded into soft golden light, and the trees across New York wore cloaks of crimson, amber, and rust. In the parks and along the railways, leaves drifted down like slow, silent whispers, and even the city itself seemed to exhale. The season of harvest had come, and with it, reflection. Cornelius Vanderbilt was in his 70s. His face, once sharp and smooth, now carried the gentle lines of time. His hair had thinned, and his hands bore the marks of thousands of decisions made with care. Yet his eyes, deep set and quiet, remained unchanged, always observing, always steady. He no longer rode the trains each day, but he still visited the depot, still walked the platforms, still nodded to conductors, and tipped his hat to passengers. When he couldn't travel, maps were brought to him, paper trails of iron and possibility. He traced them with his finger slowly, the way a gardener touches roots. But the railroads weren't the only thing on his mind now. His family had grown large. Children and grandchildren filled his home with footsteps and questions. Some had inherited his sharpness, others his silence. But few had the quiet patience that had made him who he was. His oldest son, William, was different. William had studied under his father, not in classrooms, but on train cars, in boardrooms, and beside tracks where workers hammered spikes into frozen ground. He had seen the sleepless nights, the careful planning, the refusal to take shortcuts. He knew that wealth alone meant little if not paired with wisdom. Cornelius saw this too. One chilly morning, father and son walked the gardens behind the Vanderbilt house, leaves crunching softly beneath their boots. The sky was pale gray, and the The last geese of autumn flew overhead in a quiet V. "I won't always be here to guide it," Cornelius said, his voice low but clear. "The railroad, the business, our name." William nodded. "I know, Father. Fortune is heavy," Cornelius continued. "It can build, or it can bury. You must never forget the people who ride our rails." "I won't," William said, and he meant it. The Commodore stopped walking. He looked at his son, the man he had once carried as a baby, now standing tall beside him. "I built it to last," he whispered. "You must keep it kind." Later, that year, Cornelius quietly handed over more responsibility to William. The railroads continued to grow, and so did the fortune. But as Cornelius stepped further from business, he stepped deeper into memory. He often sat by the hearth in the late afternoons, wrapped in a thick shawl, sipping warm tea. His grandchildren would bring him stories, drawings, and questions. He'd listen patiently, offer a small smile, and sometimes tell them tales of the old days, of the Swifter, his very first ferry, of rowing through fog when he was just a boy, of steam and iron and the silent pull of a river's current. One evening, his granddaughter climbed into his lap, resting her head on his chest. The fire crackled softly, and the lamps were turned low. "Grandpapa," she whispered, "are you famous?" Cornelius looked into the flames. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in his softest voice, he replied, "I'm just a man who tried to be useful." The little girl didn't fully understand, but she smiled anyway, and drifted off to sleep to the gentle sound of her grandfather's breath. As autumn deepened and the winds grew colder, Cornelius spent more time near the windows, watching the world pass quietly. His body was slower, but his thoughts remained clear. He could still hear the distant call of a train whistle echoing through the hills, and every time he heard it, a sense of peace came over him. He had laid the tracks well. He had moved people forward. He had done his part, and as the leaves fell like fading memories upon the earth, the Commodore, wrapped in warm wool and memory, closed his eyes and listened to the wind, the past, and the gentle, steady rhythm of a life well lived. Chapter 9. The station at sunset. The days had grown shorter now. Morning light arrived slowly, like an old friend taking gentle steps, and the evenings wrapped the city in quiet shadows long before supper. In the Vanderbilt household, lamps glowed early, fires burned longer, and outside, frost traced its delicate fingers along windows and railings. Cornelius Vanderbilt was an old man. He no longer walked the platforms of Grand Central. He no longer studied maps by candlelight or paced through offices with ledgers in hand. But the world he helped build continued to move. Trains still ran on time. Families still crossed states. Window, watching the world from a place of calm. Sometimes a newspaper lay folded on his lap. Other times, he simply listened, the soft clatter of hooves outside, the ticking of a nearby clock, the gentle murmur of voices in the hallway. Sophia still sat beside him each morning, her hands folded. Around his, their love, quiet and faithful, had never needed grand declarations. It had lasted through storms, through silence, and through the slow changes of time. One day, as snow dusted the rooftops, William entered with a portfolio under his arm. His face was serious, but not troubled. "I thought you might want to see the new expansion routes," he said. Cornelius looked up. His eyes, though clouded with age, still sparkled with awareness. "Sit," he said softly. They reviewed the maps together, the father tracing lines with a trembling finger, the son explaining plans with quiet confidence. It was a passing of the torch, not made with speeches, but with shared understanding. "You've done well," Cornelius said after a long silence. William nodded. "I learned from the best." Cornelius smiled, faint and warm. And then, with a calm breath, he closed the portfolio and looked out the window once more. The city beyond had changed, so much taller buildings, louder streets, faster carriages. But beneath it all, he saw the same heartbeat, movement, motion, connection, the rhythm he had followed his entire life. A few weeks later, on a golden afternoon kissed by winter's light, Vanderbilt requested a final visit to the station. Not a public event, no announcements, just a quiet ride in a carriage, wrapped in furs, with Sophia at his side. The train yard was busy as ever, steam rising, bells ringing, wheels rolling forward. But as they stepped from the carriage, the workers paused. The conductors removed their hats. The engineers stood at attention. Even the coalmen bowed their heads. He walked slowly, leaning on William's arm, until he reached the edge of the platform. There, he looked out at a long line of cars, ready to carry families into the dusk. He said nothing, but his presence said everything. That evening, back home, he sat once more by the fire. His grandchildren played in another room, laughter spilling in like birdsong. Sophia rested nearby, her knitting in her lap, her eyes occasionally drifting to her husband with love and quiet knowing. Cornelius closed his eyes, and he listened not just to the room, but to everything, the trains, the wind, the echo of waves. From long ago, the steady beat of movement that had always carried him forward. There was nothing left to prove. Silence. Cornelius Vanderbilt slept, and in the soft hum of distant rails, the world whispered thank you. Chapter 10. Sleepy rails and soft goodbyes. The snow continued to fall softly, as if the sky itself were whispering a lullaby to the world below. In the quiet corners of New York, lamps flickered like stars in cozy windows. Train whistles echoed, far in the distance low, long and calm, like the world letting out a gentle breath. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the boy who once rode a ferry, the man who shaped the steam, and the elder who laid the iron roads, had passed into memory, but not into silence. His railroads lived on not only in steel and timetables, but in stories passed from father to son, mother to daughter, conductor to child. He had built more than a business. He had built bridges between lives in train stations across the country. People still paused to read his name carved in stone. Some knew his story, some didn't, but they all walked paths he had once cleared, traveled rails he had once envisioned. In the quiet of night, William Vanderbilt, now head of the family and the railway empire, kept his father's ways alive. He did not seek to change everything. He sought only to protect the spirit of it, that quiet belief that success meant service, that motion required care, and that every journey mattered. Each evening, as the final trains departed from Grand Central Depot, porters lit lanterns, mothers wrapped scarves around their children, and travelers leaned against windows, watching stars blink above the sleeping cities. Beneath them, the rails hummed with soft energy like lullabies of the land, and in that soft hum, the memory of the Commodore rode on. Some say you could still see him in the early morning mist, standing by a quiet platform, his coat gently blowing. In the breeze, eyes watching a train disappear into the horizon. Others say you could hear his voice in the steady rhythm of the wheels, the voice of someone who never stopped moving forward, who never rushed, and who always stayed the course. But most simply feel him in the quiet confidence of a train that arrives exactly when it should. And now, dear listener, as our gentle tale draws to its close, let your mind rest like a weary traveler returning home. Close your eyes, breathe slow, let the soft rhythm of the rails carry you. May your dreams tonight be full of calm rivers, smooth tracks, and stars above wide open skies. Good night, dear friend. Sleep well, dream gently, and we'll meet again in another bedtime story.